to the start of these lectures, a series to be given by Andrew Benjamin on the line. Now, Andrew is here only for, we've tried to accommodate Andrew's reasonably short visit this time. So that, as you will see from the, if you have the events list, can I just kind of run through it so that people will know? Andrew's lecturing this evening, but on Tuesday, tomorrow, he's lecturing on Philosophy's Line. On Wednesday at 5 o'clock, sorry, on Tuesday at 5 o'clock, on Wednesday at 5 o'clock, Drawing a Line, Freud and the Drawn Unconscious. On Thursday the 27th at 7th, Framing Pictures, Transcending Marx, Walter Benjamin on the line. On Tuesday the, is that right, the 1st of February? At 5 o'clock, Malevich and the Abstracting Line. On Wednesday, the 2nd of February, at 5 o'clock, on Diagrams. On Thursday, the 3rd of February, on the Image of Different Lines. And on Friday, the 4th of February, at 1 o'clock, From Lines to Splines. Now, you can see that it's a sort of slightly complicated timetable of times at which Andrew would be lecturing. They're obviously all in the events list, and I trust on the web. They all kind of testify to the kind of the pressure of work on Andrew in various parts of the globe. So when we have him here, we have to kind of squeeze it into what times we have. But I know that you'll join with me in welcoming him here, as always, as one of the most important voices in the sort of critical discussion which goes on at the AA. I'd like to welcome Andrew Benjamin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. There are times, though, when I think I never leave. But it's only very late at night. These lectures have a specific title, and it's called From Splines to Lines, which is, in some sense, an odd title because it works in reverse. But that working in reverse is crucial to the argument I want to advance, and which in some sense fuels all of these lectures. But before I give the justification for this, let me explain, though at the AA this is unnecessary, what a spline is. If you think, as you do quite regularly, about the history of boat construction, and you wonder how boats get to have this even keel that varies as it runs through, you'll know that what you're looking at in each of the wooden struts is in fact a spline. The history of boat construction has to do with the bending of a piece of wood by weights that attach outside of the wood. And the weights vary and therefore the bow of the wood varies. And these are called splines. And indeed the word lofting, which those, Maya people amongst us, a word we love dearly, comes equally from the world of boat building. What a spline is, therefore, from the history of boat construction, is a line that is constructed by weights that are external to it. In other words, within the world of splines, there is no distinction between a bent line or a curved line and a straight line. Intuitively, and though we all distrust intuition, intuitively we think that straight lines come first and then they're bent. But in the language of splines, there is no straight line that is then bent. The construction of every line, whether bent, curved, straight, whatever you want to describe it, is a consequence of the weightings that are W-E-I-G-H-T, the weightings that are external to it that construct the line. What this means, therefore, that the line is an after effect of that which constructs it. In other words, there is no history of the line that can be written without taking into consideration that which constructs the line. Now, as soon as that move is made, we move from the centrality given to the line to that which gives you the effect of the line. Then we always are operating between a notion of technique, line construction, and the line. Therefore, the history of the line has to give us a relationship between technique and line. Therefore, if we're talking about the history of geometry, and we don't wish to lapse into the arms of idealism, what we're always concerned with is the technological apparatus linked to line construction. Whether it's a pencil or a compass or a computer click, it doesn't matter. What matters initially is this relationship between the line and the technique that gives you the line as its after effect. Now that on one level is straightforward. On one level it's simply to argue that lines have to be linked to their construction, that lines have to be seen as an after effect of the process that produces them. Now on one level this is relatively straightforward. However, on another it's not. And in order to make it both more complicated and hopefully more interesting, what I want to look at just for a moment is not the detail of the argument, but the argument of Walter Benjamin's seminal paper, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Mechanical Reproducibility. We can replace the word art with the word image. What we're interested in is the nature of the image within the era of its mechanical reproducibility, within its technical construction. Now what is interesting in Benjamin's argument, in the actual formulation of the argument, is this: that with film, something remarkable happens in the history of image construction. What happens has a disjunctive relation to the production of images prior to that. First point. The second point is that disjunctive relation generates its own concepts and its own categories through which film is to be understood. So we cannot understand film within the concepts and categories generated by the era of painting. Third point. What this opens up, of course, is the possibility of interpreting painting within the concepts and categories generated by film. In other words, we don't abandon painting, that's just postmodern nihilism. We retain painting, but we understand it now within the concepts and categories generated by a new medium, namely film. And what Benjamin then goes on to argue, and this is often overlooked, is that film is yet to attain a content that is adequate to the medium of it. In other words, it's not an argument for film qua film, it's an argument for a notion of disruption or interruption in the generation of images, which call upon us or give rise to a demand to generate the concepts and categories proper to that, and through which we'd interpret those images, but there is no content proper to film in and of itself. Film is always searching for its proper content. But flipped back, what this does is then say, look, the history of image construction is animated, is given another life by the nature of film. Now, what I want to argue, and is fundamental to all of these lectures, is that we live now not simply within the age of mechanical reproducibility, but we live in the age of digital reproducibility. Namely, that the digital image gives us something that we hadn't had hitherto, and that therefore what we need to develop, and I think this is that fundamental to the job of architectural theory, is to think this through within the domain of architecture, is what are the concepts and categories proper to architectural theory given the advent of a new form of reproducibility. And if that's the case, if that is true, and that's the supposition, it's a supposition, if that is true, what it then allows for is a reinterpretation of the role of the line within the history of the writing about the line. And therefore what I want to try and do in these lectures, and I'll explain a bit more about it in a moment, over the next few days, is to look at a number of texts, not simply to identify their own argumentative structure, that's partly what I want to do, but to say, look, given what we now know, as it were, how do we interpret these texts? Texts in psychoanalysis, in art, in architecture, therefore, moving in and out of a relationship to architecture. What can we learn about these texts vis-a-vis the nature of the image, vis-a-vis the nature of representation? Given that, we now have new concepts and categories within which to interpret them. So therefore, what I want to argue for, if you like, is a type of materialism. A materialism in the strict sense. Sorry, I now have to undo my microphone, take off the jacket. I can't do it. I'll do it. Sorry. I'll do it this way. A type of materialism. Materialism in the very precise sense that an idealist position would idealize geometry and think there was simply what Colin Rowe would call an ideal geometry. An idealist position would be to think that there's just one thing called tectonics, and you can idealize tectonics by talking about the ideality of the joint, and you'd become Kenneth Frampton. In other words, there are varying forms of idealism. And what one needs to do is to think through a possibility of a materialist architectural theory. And a materialist architectural theory is one that is attentive to technique, is attentive to the specificities of production. So what I want to do in these lectures is try and develop this in a very specific way. I want to look at three particular domains. The first is a philosophical domain. The second is to do with psychoanalysis. And the third is to look at issues around the diagram. Now, why have I chosen these? The point of looking at a philosophical argument, which you'll have to bear with tomorrow if you want to bear with that sort of thing, is to look at a particular debate that takes place in the 17th and 18th century around the nature of the line. There were three schools of thought. If you couldn't see something, it was because God was at work somewhere, and it didn't matter that you couldn't see it. The second position was that if you couldn't see something, it was because it was slightly hidden, and if you could move the bushes back, you could see it. The third position is that there is actually a link to the notion of material presence. There is an immaterial force. So within the 17th century and the 18th century, these three differing positions are ones you can attribute proper names to. The first one, the religious one, is of no interest for the moment. The second one can be attributed to the 18th century French philosopher Fontenelle. And Fontenelle has a very interesting position. He says, and I'll talk about this in more detail tomorrow, he says, imagine you're standing in front of a theatre, a stage, and on the stage things are happening and people are moving, but you can't quite discern why. In other words, you can see movement, but you can't understand the reasons for that movement. You can't see what's causing it. And he says it's very easy. Imagine if you moved back the sides of the stage. What you'd see are cables and ropes moving everything. In other words, there is something that moves the universe, that it is visible, we can't see it, therefore we just need to move things back. So he wants a mechanical theory of the universe, but it's mechanical in which, as it were, everything can be seen. Now, counterposed to this is, to my mind, the great thinker of immateriality, and therefore, for me, the pivotal thinker in relation to what I do. And that's the 17th century German philosopher Leibniz, who wants to argue that there is what he calls in German Kraft, or in our language, in English rather, force. There's some power behind that which operates. In other words, that we have to understand physical presence in relation to a notion of potentiality or a notion of force. I'll give you a very clear example of how this occurs. For Descartes, the point is a simple. It's just a simple. And I have another simple, and between the two I draw a line. And hence you have Cartesian geometry. Hence you have the Nolli plan. Hence you have the grid. Hence you have the idea that we see in Ledoux, that everything is given, autonomous, drawn by a series of lines which have single meanings and single unique meanings, because the line is a relationship between 2 points. Descartes. Counterposed to this is the extraordinary definition that Leibniz gives to the line in his correspondence with the French philosopher Arnaud. He says, and I paraphrase, that the line is the point, the point is the moment in which there is a concurrence of an infinite number of lines. In other words, every point is the after effect of a potential infinity. To give definition to a point is already to still, to suppress, to calm the force of the infinite by attributing a specific determination to it. Now, if you think yourself back to high school and you remember that wonderful moment you discovered differential calculus, you did the big S on the board, you did the X and Y, and you wrote the numbers in, and you realized that when you rotated a volume around the XY axis, what you would do, that was that great moment, you remember it, what you were doing was discovering something about an infinite potential that was stilled by attributing to X and Y a certain numeric order. But what was always possible was something else. In other words, that what the invention of calculus brought with it was a notion of the infinite that was fundamentally different to the Cartesian notion of the infinite. And therefore the drawing of a line for Leibniz is of a fundamentally different nature to the drawing of the line for Descartes. And what I want to look at tomorrow is looking at Fontenelle and Descartes and Leibniz, which I know is to step one stage back from architecture, but it's really meant to inform you. I was at a jury 2 days ago and people were saying, Cartesian grid, bad thing. And because I'm an unpleasant person, I said to one of them, why? And he said, well, everyone knows that Cartesian geometry is bad. And I said, well, how could geometry be bad? He said, well, it's the grid. And I said, well, what's wrong with the grid? And then we didn't get anywhere. But all I would want to do is provide you with arguments, not for the virtue of the grid. The grid could hardly be anything moral. But to see in what sense there can be an architectural theoretical argument, the object of which is to say there are other ways of thinking outside the grid, in which the grid is not a bad thing, but there is an actual argument that says there are other ways of calibrating space. If we want to give two proper names to that, we can have Nolli on the one hand, the grid guy, we can have Piranesi on the other hand, the Campomarzio, and realize that all of a sudden you see two fundamentally different senses of geometries, fundamentally two different urbanisms, and they're based around the potentials of two different sorts of geometries. With the Piranesi you have to press it, but you can begin to see in what sense that's the case. So there is some value then to taking one step back and working through the laborious philosophical detail of Leibniz on the one hand and Descartes and Fontenelle on the other to begin to see how this argument unfolds. I then want to move, and this is in some sense drawing on work I've done before, but this is try and attempt to make it more synthetic, that an obsession, and here I'll share this with you, I have with Freud's obsession with drawing. If you look at Freud's correspondence, he's continually continually drawing. And what he wants to do is to try and draw the relationship between the unconscious and the conscious. And he does it much like Lacan by drawing a line. You have the conscious above and the unconscious beneath, to which the response is, well, it just can't be that easy. The reason why is that if there is a fundamental ontological distinction between the unconscious and the conscious, how could you represent that on a piece of paper? Namely, if there is something like a material presence and an immaterial force, what's it like to draw the relationship between a material presence and an immaterial force? And if you go back, as we all must, to Freud's 1915 paper on the unconscious, what becomes interesting is not the topographical model which he draws, but the economic model. Namely, that there is a relationship between appearance and that which drives it, the élan vital behind it that gives it to you, that is not reducible to simple representational drawings. And that's the key. Namely, can we think of the question of drawing outside the hold of representation? Can I show you an image that is not a representation? And that, if you like, is the opening up to the final part of what I want to talk about, which is, the diagram. I want to return to the question of the diagram because I actually think that even though it seemed to be something we talked about 2 years ago and then forgot to talk about, it remains of incredible importance in my belief for the following reason. Namely that, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, that what the diagram stages, very simply is this, is that architecture, and I want to argue this in more detail in regard to a specific topic, architecture is inextricably bound up with the means of its own representation and the way in which it represents itself. So if you're an architect or an architectural student and you show me a photoshopped image of a building, why is that an image of architecture? If you're an architectural student or an architect and you show me a fly-through, why is that the image of architecture? Now, there are answers to these questions, but the question is, why do these things count as the image of architecture? Now, I want to look at this in more detail at the moment, but if you just let your imaginations work, and I don't have images because I don't really like images, but if you go and have a look at the models for Eisenman's new railway station in Naples, and the museum in Paris, and you look at these models, the only question you'd ask yourself as architectural students or as architects is, what am I looking at? Am I looking at wood? Am I looking at a very little building that will one day become a very big building? What am I looking at? And once you ask that question, then you have to introduce both the image as a question and not as an accomplished fact, but equally a certain iconoclasm. And I don't think we attribute enough a force to the importance of iconoclasm. I mean, don't give me the money shot. I actually want a discussion of the image. Don't give me a Photoshop blue because it doesn't exist in nature. I want to discuss the architectural image. If you go and look at these models that Eisenman presents, when you look at them, you see one thing and one thing only, and that's a surface constructed by spline-based geometry. It may look like wood, it may look like a reference to Sarantino's wonderful sculpture of the Veiled Virgin, in which the veil operates over her face, which it does, but what you're actually looking at is what is possible and only possible because of the use of spline-based geometries. And that's what you look at when you look at the wood. In other words, you're not looking at a representation of the building.
You're looking at a material enactment of a certain way of constructing geometries. Now, we can argue this backwards and forwards, but it seems to me fundamentally important that when you look at models, what becomes interesting is the nature of the image. And once it's no longer viewed as a model of a building, so it's a very little version of something that will become bigger, but something else is at stake, namely the enactment of a certain type of way of thinking about geometry, then we're forced to reconsider the nature of the image. We're forced to reconsider the nature of representation, and we're forced to reconsider it because of the nature of the way images are created and geometries are created. Namely, it's the move to the spline that forces us to reconsider the line. And we reconsider it by using the concepts and categories proper to digital-based geometries, digital-based images that are antithetical on the one hand to earlier work, but allow earlier work to live in ways we hadn't thought. Now, in order to make this more specific, what I want to do is try and track this argument, and this will be sort of both the beginning of the lecture and its end. So it's both, but it takes a bit long because it's both, through a specific problem. And it's this, that usually when we think about the model, usually when we think about the drawing, we think about a certain narrative of construction. You must remember when you're in juries and you're a student and you're there, you say, well, the first thing I did was this, then I had this idea, then I did this, blah, blah, blah. And you tell a linear narrative of construction as though the truth of your project resides in the linear narrative. Of course, you know that's not true, but you act as though it's true. And what I want to do then is try and work away at this problem of the linear narrative of construction in the age of the digital by raising the question of the archive. Now, the archive looks like a rather ornate term, but it's very simple. The archive is simply this. I run a museum. I want to exhibit architecture. I want to collect architecture. Sure, no problem. In the age of digital reproduction, what do I collect? Do I collect a digital image? How do I collect it? What do I collect first? Where do I start? In other words, that the whole narrative of the archive is undone by the nature of digital reproduction, of digital production. Now, I don't think this is either a bad thing or a good thing. I'm not a moralist. I just think it's a thing. It happens, and therefore what we have to do is think about it. So what I want to do is try and make all these introductory comments I've just made more precise by working this through the question of the archive, which I believe is the one of the ways of testing the problems that we have and that are given to us, that are inescapable in the age in which we live. So what is at stake in the question of the digital and its connection to acquisition through archiving is a shift in how the relationship between the nature of representation and the archive is understood. If in the history of painting, it's not a problem. You have sketches, you have drawings, you have paintings, you construct an archive. While collecting digital images and the machinery, hardware, that creates them emerges as a recent problem. In the case of architecture, it needs to be linked, or this will be my argument, to two related suppositions. And in looking at these, I think we open up the very problem. In the first instance, as I suggested in the very beginning of my comments, is that architecture is inextricably bound up with its means of representation, while of course not being reducible to those means. Architecture is not just its representation. It would be the height of naivety to think that. In the second, it is that technology has always played a structuring role in providing the means for representability. I'll give you an example. The development of the compass made the move from the circle to the ellipse a possibility. A possibility often articulated in terms of a proper name. The name Borromini means the move from the circle to the ellipse brought about by the history of drawing instruments. It also means San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane and other buildings. But equally what the name Borromini names is a certain development in the history of drawing instruments. Fundamental shifts in the nature of reproducibility have a concomitant effect on the status of the representation, and thus on what we're being asked to look at. What this dramatizes is that architecture now has a new and more problematic relation to its own image. Again, the image cannot be divorced from architecture, and yet architecture as an activity cannot be identified with its varying and, in the end, incompatible images. I mean, the only lapse into anecdote I will now make. I once ran a workshop in another country where I got the students to do the same project, and I got them to do it as a drawing, as an animation, as a 3D printout, as any varying forms of representation. It was the same thing, inverted commas. But each mode of representation taught them something new about the nature of the project. At the end of the workshop, what they realized was there was no one way adequate to represent the project. Therefore, there was no one adequate representation. So there was no way that architecture could be reduced to one representation. It was a play of representations. So there are, if you like, can be incompatible images of the same project. And therefore what we need to think about more and more is not to lapse, as I said, to the naivety of thinking there are just images. But when you see an image, ask yourself, of what is this an image? It's not just a picture of a building. While there can be little to dispute in terms of the need continually to rethink the effect of how the shift in how reproducibility occurs, the digital has introduced a factor that is not explicable straightforwardly in terms of the hardware and the final product. The difference has to do with the presence of software. In other words, it is too simplistic to think of the digital simply in terms of computing and the role of computers. In other words, to think of the digital simply in terms of computers is to make the mistake that a lot of thinkers, especially Heidegger, do when they think about technology. And that's to come up with a monolithic notion of technology, as though there's just technology and our relation to it. What I won't argue it here, because I'll argue it elsewhere when we move on, is I think there's a fundamental different relationship to technology, and that is mediated by the relationship between hardware and software. While on the one hand is a truism and is sort of uninteresting, because truisms are, what it does is it forces back onto us a need to break with the concept of technology, and instead of thinking about technology, develop what I would want to call an ontology of techniques. In other words, to think about techniques in the plural rather than technology as a universal concept. A very clear example pedagogically, in the school in which I teach, I'm trying to get all first years in design, fashion, interiors, viscom, architecture, to do the same course for their communications. Because what they actually share is software. What they'll do with it is something quite different. So the visual communication students and the architecture students will use Maya in a fundamentally different way. However, what they share is software. What they then do with that software is radically different. But that has to do with an argument about techniques. It doesn't have to do with an argument about learning the software. Equally, it doesn't turn the technology, the hardware, into a monolithic concept. And it's a very interesting moment in architecture, in design schools. This is an architecture school, but in design schools where architecture forms one of a number of different subjects, how there is now a platform, and that platform is given by software. You can even see it with fashion students linked to architecture students, where textiles now can be constructed using the same sort of animation software programs that architects or animators will use, so that you can get materials that are already surfaces, already operative surfaces, and that's a result of software. the same software that an architect or an animator will use in a fundamentally different way. Now all of that, blah, 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 all of that forces us to reconsider not technology, that's too easy to talk about technology, but techniques. And techniques is bound up with a different locus of activity, and that is, how do we have a philosophy of software? How do we have a theory of software and software's relationship to the technology? Now, while there is a direct link between what software can achieve and the relative power of computers, it remains the case that what is seen in terms of images are only ever the effects of certain software applications as opposed to others. And this will change as time unfolds. Animation software has opened up representational possibilities that could never have occurred in terms of the use of Cartesian-based CAD systems. I mean, you know this. It goes without saying. The job of architectural theory is to think it. In fact, the argument is more specific. The practice of lofting within Maya, for example, has become a way of marking the limits of connectivity within certain designs. Moreover, they are limits that will have a direct effect, in certain instances, on how the joining and opening of space frames can be understood. The space frame lives again because of the way in which Maya operates. Equally, the rotation of isopalms becomes a way of introducing folds, marking different ways of integrating, yet differentiating between circulation paths. Developing some of the arguments implicit in the above will begin to define in what way it becomes possible to think through the relationship between digital production and architecture on the one hand, but equally digital production and the archive. I mean, what do I keep when I keep to show, not this year's show, but next year's, and the year after, and the year after? What do I keep in my archive in the age of digital reproducibility? The answer to that question will tell us something about the nature of the digital. Now, rather than attempting a synoptic analysis, I want to put greater weight will be given to the way of distinguishing between the computer and software, greater weight will be given to the way distinguishing between the computer and software reconfigures issues pertaining to representation. Fundamental to that reconsideration is a shift in emphasis. Traditionally, drawings, diagrams, planned sections, the drawings of lines, are incorporated into a sequence. The sequence accounts for the narrative of building. Archiving becomes bound up with that narrative. Indeed, in certain instances, it may not only seek to replicate it, but create it. A different narrative possibility will open another archive. What is introduced here is the process of archivization, and therefore to see archivization as a site of differential possibilities. Posing the problem in any other way would have to assume that what is there to be archived is already known and given in advance, and therefore history is merely the history of historicism. Its place in and as part of the narrative occurs prior to any process that would seek to establish the archive. It would just be the same old thing. Once it can be conceded that this need not be the case, the mere supposition that this need not be the case, then archivization as an activity has to be spelt out in greater detail. I mean, one has to be absolutely serious at this point. If we consider that the archive is not a linear narrative, or that production is not linear, the moment we consider that, the very structure of the archive changes radically. The very structure of the image changes radically as a consequence. And therefore, the curator's job of what he or she collects is radically transformed in an instant. That very moment of just considering this as a question opens up the whole idea of curation, the archive, and therefore the nature of the image. The question of the narrative of archivization opens up the problem to which I've already made allusion, namely the temporality of narrative construction. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida has already identified this problematic area in his sustained treatment of the archive in his book Mal d'Archives. He argues that, and I quote, archivization produces as much as it registers the event. In other words, the archivization creates the narrative as much as it registers it. That's why, and this is very important, that's why there is ambivalence. That's why that fragility is fundamental. Even though digital reproduction shatters linear narratives, I could act as though that weren't the case. I could say, look, and students do this all the time. They go, here's my little model, my digital whatnot, here's the fly-through, here's the blah-blah, and here's the model. As though it's the same story that a student would have told 20 years ago. The structure of the narrative is the same, even though the very mode of construction is fundamentally different. So there is an inbuilt fragility in the argument, namely that even though these concepts and categories are new and demand to be taken up, they can always be trashed. That's why it's never as easy as, oh, this is new, let's all do it another way. Everything is recuperable. That's why there is a demand to be insistent on the question of other possibilities. So decisions in regard to the construction of the archive are not external to the process. This begins to construct the framework within which it becomes possible to pose with greater acuity the question of the relationship between the archive and the digital, and therefore our understanding of all these terms, including the line. Later in the same text, Derrida touches on this very problem. While discussed in direct terms, it adheres productive in his own question. He writes, and I quote, in typical Derridian way, je me demandais, I wondered, at what moment, at what proper moment, what is the proper moment of the archive, if there is one, the instant where the archive begins. And he says, this is not memory, living or spontaneous memory, but a certain experience that it has a prosthetic relation to technique. In other words, that the archive is not living memory, nor is it the Proustian, gosh, lime cake in the tea, double-click Maya, snap to grid, it's all clear to me. He's putting both of these possibilities to one side, surprise, surprise, and then saying that if there is the moment of archivization, the moment, as he says, stricto sensu of the archive, then it exists in a prosthetic relation to support, to technique. In the same, end quote, in the same passage he goes on to write of letters suspended and floating on the screen. Prior to pursuing what is identified in this passage, it should be noted that the distinction between words and images is such that any simple conflation occurring under the heading of the digital denies their differing modes of digital production. It's simply naive to think that Word and Rhino are doing the same thing. You know they're not, therefore how do you think they're different? That they're different, not a problem. How do you think they're different? That's the interesting question. What does animation software working through time do to space that Word could never do? And how do you think that conception of space, given that both of them are taking place within the space that you call your screen? How do you think that difference? And that's the challenge. Now, following Derrida's observations, the first is positive. The relationship between the instant of the archive and technique correctly identifies, in my view at least, the way the process of archivization and thus the narrative of construction are to be understood. The second has to complicate the formulation. While the letters may float and appear suspended upon the screen, always on the edge of the archive, apparently, until the save command is deployed, it must not be forgotten that what occurs on the screen is a technique marking the intersection of hardware and software. Again, the particular quality of the intersection cannot escape the general process of clarification. There are, in addition, deontological concerns relating to the status of documents, a problem that is most emphatic in connection to texts and documents that have to be classified as either fictional or non-fictional. What happens to the category of fiction when it comes to digital reproduction as opposed to non-fiction? Completely vanishes. So therefore there's no way of thinking about what appears on the screen within the categories in which we understand conventional narrative. Oh, it's just fictional. I mean, how could a fly-through be fictional? Of course it's fictional. What does fiction mean in that instance? These words no longer apply. Therefore there's the need for new terminology. Not just new terminology, it's demanded by what's there. If there is a way through these questions and complications, it inheres in what happens to the conception of representation when it concerns digital reproducibility. In the age of mechanical reproducibility, what was lost, or at least this was Walter Benjamin's argument, was an overriding sense of the original. As photography and prints, for example, continued to define specific trajectories in the practice of art, it remains clear in what way it can be argued that the reproducible or the reproduction is the original. I mean, it's very clear that what both marks the high point of Benjamin's text is the idea that the photograph could be an original, hence there is no original. This as a mode of argumentation vanishes when we reach the digital because the question of the origin is dramatically reposed. Of the many important consequences that flow from positing this positioning of art after reproducibility, perhaps the most germane in this instance is the introduction of mechanical techniques which, while related to authorial intentional acts, are not their direct result. Again, parenthetically, one of the interesting things, as you know, about software is that what it can do potentially is undermine the Oedipal nature of teaching, not simply because you know more than your teacher, but that was probably always true. What becomes more important is that working in groups, working everyone in relation to what's made possible by software, moves the idea of the atelier away from the master builder to a thinking about the supremacy of software in relation to which everyone is working. Equally, that can be undone by attempting to bring back the cult of the expert. So everything is fragile, everything's ambivalent, but there is a potential anti-Oedipal structure within the celebration of software. And it's very interesting that the great theorist of this was, of course, the playwright Heinrich Ibsen. Ibsen wrote his play The Master Builder as the architect who had to commit suicide given the advent of technology. In other words, he saw that his mastery would be undone by the advent of technology, and all the master builder can do is commit suicide. Suicide is, of course, the ultimate Oedipal response to a situation with which you cannot cope. Therefore, there may be a way round suicide and death, and that is to recognize that all of a sudden we have a different site of creativity, a different site of activity that's not driven by Oedipal relations and masters. And that is made possible, or the suggestion is, it could be made possible by this advent. Once mechanical techniques emerge in this way, then production can begin to be explicated in terms of techniques, no longer in terms of individual mastery. Techniques need to be differentiated from any quick identification with the technical. The technical is the process independently of particular and strategic applications. The latter opens up a definition of technique. Even technique, however, cannot be imbued with a singular quality. And we have to really give a lot of thought to what a technique would be. We have to study techniques. We give a very clear example in art and then try and make it more complicated. The American painter Rosenquist, who does these extraordinary large murals. And when you look at them, you think, how does he do this? It's very simple. The way he does it is through having very small collages with which he starts. And a very interesting recent exhibition of Rosenquist's work, it was the first time it was done, showed these panels which were sort of 30 feet long, 20 feet high, extraordinary, monumental paintings, and a very small collage next to them, which every part is laid out in advance. The American artist Jonathan Lasker does the same sort of thing. He does these huge abstract paintings, but each one has a very small collage that allows him to structure everything. So if you're an archivist and you're collecting this work, or if you're a curator and you're showing it, and you want to be truthful to the nature of technique, as they did when they showed this recently in the Guggenheim, you have the huge Rosenquist paintings and then the small collages. So you see the narrative moving from the small collage to the large painting. You see the narrative of production. It works as a linear story. So there is a notion of technique linked to painting, a notion of technique linked to all things. But it's this idea of technique is that of a linear narrative. What happens in the realm of the digital when that idea of the linear narrative has collapsed? The digital image does not remember another image. Rosenquist's paintings remember the collage. They remember them. When you look at them, they remember them. There is I was once a little collage, now I'm a great big painting. And you can see the memory at work. Now the digital image, while it has a relation to the history of images, how could it not? While it forms part of a bank of images, how could it not? does not remember another image. It may recall its origination in software, but that recall is not bound to an earlier image before which there was nothing. Hence the value of Derrida's refusal of both the conventions of memory and anamnesis. In other words, the notion of anamnesis is there was an original image and it gets remembered. Or that there was an originating moment and then it reappears. This argument here is that there wasn't an earlier image, so the whole structure of the digital works outside or demands us think of it beyond the structure of memory as we understand it. Therefore, we have the troubling question of, if it does remember, how does it remember? What does a digital image recall? And it's very interesting, if you want to take this a stage further, the one great investigation of the image, it's late so I'll be apocalyptic, the one great, of course done by an Italian filmmaker, the only great theorists of the image, in Antonioni's Blow Up. This is the most sustained investigation of the image I know, in which there is, the ruse of the film is that a crime took place. It was inadvertently photographed. But if you blow the image up more and more and more, you'll get to the truth. You'll uncover the body that lies in the garden, if you remember, though you don't. It was a very long time ago, before you were all born. The film, it's a very good film, it's worth seeing. But the ruse here is that the truth of the image resides in what you cannot see but is there within it. And if we make it bigger and bigger and blow it up more and more, we'll discover the truth, because the image, in some sense, remembers everything that's in it. Everything that's in it can be recalled. And the strategy of the film, though it does play with this enormously, is to have the idea of this image can remember something within it. Now, it's not simply this is an analog photo, and therefore it's possible to blow up an analog image while it's not possible to blow up a digital image. That's uninteresting. What is interesting is the idea that here we have a ruse that within the truth of the image resides in its depth. With the digital image, its truth does not reside in its depth, because it doesn't have any depth. That doesn't mean that it's mere surface, but it means that the opposition surface depth is adequate to think about an analog photo, but no longer apposite to think about a digital image. This means that the problem of what representational status is to be attributed to the digital image has become a problem. And it's a problem within architecture that's doubled. Images without a history of images, images which do not represent on the level of the image. In other words, that the truth of the image does not lie in its capacity to have represented or present something, even if what it is hidden. Problems of this nature are more exacting when there is a fundamental shift from the immateriality of the image to the material presence of architecture. As I've said, if you go back and have a look at the images of the roof structures of Eisenman's Naples railway station or the museum in Paris, if you look at the images of those roof structures, what you see is the operation of spline geometries. Now, one can be critical of that by saying that Eisenman's actually not really interested in the operation of materials. He's plan-driven and therefore geometry-driven, and what he shows you are images of geometry. So it's not Lars Spybrook will show you images of materials. They're all images. But when Lars Spybrook shows you an image, it's an image of materiality and its possibilities. When Eisenman shows you an image, it's an image, though it's material, of certain geometries, not Cartesian geometries, but spline-based geometries. That's what you're seeing. Both of them look like little dinky wooden things, but what you're seeing is fundamentally different in each instance. So they don't represent anything. They are enactments of certain architectural commitments. All of these considerations have to be understood as giving to the digital image the complexity that it demands, and which have to be acknowledged as constructing how answers to the general question of the relationship between the digital and the archive can be adequately addressed. So once you lodge something outside linear narratives, outside of the representational, then the very interesting question to the curator is, all right, what do you collect? Part of the overall point relates in the first place, as I've indicated, to what is collected And then the second, to the interpretability of the collected. Once you have something in your collection that is not explicable straightforwardly in terms of linear narrative productions, how do you interpret it? Not how in the sense of, how late at night do you have to sit up in order to interpret it, but how in terms of what concepts and categories do you use in order to understand it. Part of the overall, even though digital images are images, precisely because they are effects of software, they demand an interpretive framework that is compatible with their technological production. And indeed, that's the point I suppose I really want to make. That digital images demand an interpretive framework that is compatible with their technical production. Now that interpretive framework will have a relationship to the history of interpretation of images. How could it not? And how could it not? However, if one's attentive to what I called before a materialist version of the interpretation of images, then you can never interpret an image as though it hadn't been produced, as though God had suddenly appeared and said, and let there be images, as though there was no notion of production linked to them. That doesn't mean that the production or techniques gives you the truth of the image, but instead of idealizing the image, to see them as after effects of the process of production gives another way into thinking about them, and then allows us to begin to delineate between one form of image and another, and not think of them as just all images. Indeed, this may be the point. These images, digital images, can be stored relatively easily. Even animations can be filed. The presence of these events, to deploy Derrida's term, has already complicated the narrative of architectural production. What is essential is that archivization, itself already an act of construction, and therefore inherently interpretive, and the interpretation of the archive remain attentive. And what they have to remain attentive to is complication. But because we're lazy, we can always forget that. But to recognize complication is to be attentive to specificity. Not only should complications be allowed to unfold their own potential, they'll also have the effect of causing both the content and the status of the archive to be reworked, because they cause the way in which we think about the status of the archive and what it is to be archived to be worked. Differing ages of technical reproducibility have a registration that can resist the temporality of historicism, the construction of linear narratives. If attention is paid to the possibility of narratives configured by other temporal orders, and indeed this is the second last point I want to make, that again, following the import of Walter Benjamin's argument is very clear, is that if the concepts and categories linked to images have to bring with them an attention to the way those images are produced, given fundamental shifts, and we can debate what they are, but let's assume there are such things, given fundamental shifts in the nature of the production of images, it therefore follows, almost by definition, that there have to be different concepts and categories. That doesn't close down what had happened hitherto, and indeed it gives what happened hitherto a new life. What gives painting the capacity to live on is that it occurs after photography, and that therefore we can talk about the nature of the relationship between painting and photography. We can use some of the concepts proper to photography to give to painting that other possibility. In other words, that invention here doesn't close down, it opens up. What that means is that thinking disruption allows for continuity, but only the continuity of discontinuity. But with the continuity of discontinuity, we can't be lazy any longer. We have to insist that architectural theory or the theory of painting or whatever, it always has a role, and that is with every discontinuity, there has to be the attempt to think its possibility, or to think what it makes possible, or even to identify it within its own possibilities. So progress, therefore, as a temporal construction, needs to be supplanted by the demands of innovation. Not the sort of naivety of the avant-garde, but the recognition that there are such things as innovations, though we have to debate what they are. But to the extent that there are innovations, they make demands. And they're not innovations merely on the level of ideas. They're innovations that have technical enactment. Part of that technical enactment could be the writing of a book and its content. Part of that technical enactment could be the making of a film and its content, the building of architecture, or the creation of images and their content, etc., etc. So innovation is not simply an idea, though it is an idea. It always has what Bataille would call a base materialism. Namely, it's always enacted materially. Now, progress, as I said, as a temporal construction, needs to be supplanted by the demands of innovation. A supplanting that takes place, of course, in the name of progress. In other words, we want to win back progress, or back from Kant and the Enlightenment, back from its being damned by Adorno and others, and to think the notion of progress not as perfectibility, but back to the idea that we can think innovation, and we can take more seriously the response we have to innovations, though we always need to debate what they are. Now, let me just sum up this brief foray. What I tried to do was simply outline a relatively straightforward point, that once we move from a monolithic conception of technology, once we move away from that, to recognize that our bodies have a relationship to software and hardware, but it's both, and that software can extend from one domain to another. It can be the same program, but used in radically different ways. Once we accept that as a point of departure, then two things emerge. On the one hand, we have to develop, in my view, what I would call an ontology of techniques. Namely, how do we think about techniques as sites of plural activities? First point. Second point, and second point is what my lecture is about. I want to then go back and look at the development of the line and drawing, but specifically the drawn line, in 17th and 18th century philosophy, in the writings of Walter Benjamin, who worries about the relationship between foreground and background, etc., etc., in the drawings of Freud, and the general discussions about the diagram, to try and say that within all of this, what may appear arcane thought are things that are central to how we would need to think were we to develop a response to what the techniques demand. Namely that, and this is the hubris or the arrogance, or if not both, attached to all of this, that there is such a thing as architectural theory. It emerges from the practice of design, not in the sense of describing what designers do. That's what designers do. What architectural theory does is actually think in that locus. Namely, given shifts in technical reproducibility, what's the thinking fundamental to it? A notion of architectural history not driven by the concerns of history, which are totally proper, but driven by the question of design, has always to be focused on, given adventures and developments within design practice, how does history reconfigure itself such that it's always in a state of address or dialogue with that? And I not for a moment do I suggest that I have the answers, because I don't. But what I want to try and do in these lectures is work through a series of different focuses, different points of reference within Western philosophy and literature and history, etc., to identify more and more precisely how this is to be understood. That's enough. Thank you.
Okay, could we have some questions? I mean, while people are thinking, could I just ask the following question? I mean, it seems to me like in the radicalism of what you're kind of arguing, is that in some sense the interpretation of something, shall we say, a line, will depend in some sense on the technology that's produced it. And in a sense, I can sort of see that. After all, we have an entirely different literature, as it were, for dealing with the question of outline in painting from the outline in work by pencil, and again from some kind of etching. But it doesn't seem to me that, or maybe I'm blanked and haven't seen it, that there has been a theory of what you might call the line within the digital. That is to say, it in some rather passive way has remained, if one asks, what is the line when you see it in a computer-generated kind of piece, as it were, it almost remains something at the level of the representation of a line according to another technology, be that kind of drawing or whatever. And so really, I mean, the very simple question in terms of, say, the design work of students is, what would it be for them to think about the line they draw digitally, which would correspond, as it were, to that critical injunction that they interpret it according to the technology that produces it?
Well, that's the question. I mean, there is no one answer, but part of the answer is hinging on what you're saying, is that, and you can see this in when students create something on the screen and then make a model of it. When they render when rendering is one of the most interesting activities, because rendering gives volume to something, and therefore the trap is whether or not to read what you've rendered volumetrically. And once you read what you've rendered volumetrically, then in a certain instance you are interpreting it representationally. And there's no reason why that oughtn't be the case, but if it is the case, I mean, it has to be argued for. And one of the things that, so that's the first point. And the second point is that, I mean, the standard position I've often advanced here, and I will in one of my lectures, is talk about the distinction between volumetric diagrams and programmatic diagrams. And I've probably talked a lot over the years about this, but I'll mention just very briefly. It seems to me that one of the very interesting things that you can do is with a complex program, and the example, which is one that I was involved in, was the project for the new museum in Cairo, where they had a very complex program where they divided Egyptian history into 7 periods. They said of a factor, take 0 in the middle, and then you can say that this period was more important than that, which is more important than that, which is less important. So it went 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, minus 1, 2, 3. You had an hour to go through the museum. Therefore, they wanted you to experience the -1, -3 part for 8 minutes and the +3 part for 15 minutes. It's a very strict program. The question was, how do you understand that complex programmatic enactment, given that it all worked through circulation? How do you begin to understand the relationship between program and circulation, where you had to experience all 7 parts of history, but you're only allowed 8 minutes for one bit, 15 minutes, And what we ended up working on was a series of, using a certain program, was to create sausages, which were circulation tubes. So we used a program which you people know better than I, called Rhino, to create, as it were, Rhino sausages, which gave you circulation and program running together, so then you could deal with questions of adjacencies. But what was interesting about that, you ended up with a series of interweaving Rhino sausages, which, if you're a certain form of architect, you just plonk on the ground and call it your museum. If you're another sort of architect, like Rem Koolhaas, you drop it in a box and call it your museum. In other words, that what we'd represented was the question of program and circulation. We hadn't and it was volumetric, but it wasn't the representation of an architectural volume. So therefore, I mean, on one level it's very straightforward and uninteresting, but what that does mean that the appearance of volume is not volume. And so to recognize that the appearance of volume is not volume is then to say, all right, how does the appearance of volume become volumetric? So what you have to say that what's on the screen is, as it were, not what appears. Therefore, part of the research, and it's a new problem, is how do you move from a programmatic diagram to a volumetric diagram, if you don't see the volumetric diagram as simply representational. So I think there are but you need a very complex program, or a relatively complex program, to begin to understand how that's an issue. And that's why public architecture becomes the most interesting ways in which to think about this. But as I said, on one level it's very straightforward, but the challenge is to actually theorize that particular problem.
I sort of have a feeling that, like, this is one of those moments in the school where one really ought to kind of, like, freeze the scene, because I think something kind of very, very important kind of hangs on that. Do you know what I mean? It's like one of those moments where kind of, you know, students and indeed staff kind of think, you know, sometimes kind of, what's that? You know, what's the problem going on here? And I don't quite get it. Not that I think you give, I mean, it seems to me you give one possible answer, but it sort of evades the problem that you rose, that you brought forward. I mean, my intuition somehow, without being certain about it, is that what you did was to raise the question of the line in what we might call a traditional kind of either formalist sense, but I mean, you know, one which we started by saying had to pay attention to the technology under which the conditions of that line had arisen. And then somehow, in answering the question about the computer, you say something which is somehow related, perhaps not initially, to computational kind of issues, or even immediately to the line into the computer, but rather with series of program which have tended to coexist with the rise of the computer. I mean, I don't know if I'm making myself kind of clear. And I feel there's it's not a question of being right or wrong, but I feel there's like a stage that has to be gone through before you can get there. And but at the same time, it seems to me, unlike many talks I've been to, it sort of puts its finger on something sort of extraordinarily crucial. Except I'm well aware that I'm kind of framing it badly. What I'm really trying to say is, in your answer, had you pursued your original formal thought, or had you sort of smuggled in, which it's you know, it's not about a criticism, had you smuggled in something which is always already going on in the architecture, which, you know, is called digital, in which one might be asking of the digital, would you mind separating certain formal, kind of formalist almost, issues about the medium, and certain substantive propositions? I'm aware of putting the question very badly.
Yeah, on one level, I am, you know, there's rum in my cellar. I'm a smuggler. But having said that, what I do want to insist upon, I mean, just to be very old-fashioned, is that there is, you know, it's like, I mean, who is it? Is that Richard Serra likes architecture, but not very much, because he thinks it's devalued sculpture. Now, with the greatest respect to Richard Serra, I think he's completely wrong, that architecture and sculpture are only interesting because they have an affinity with their difference. And the difference is that for architecture to be architecture, it has to work as architecture. Therefore, you can't think about architecture without thinking about program. Now, the problem about thinking about program, which is always breathtakingly unfashionable, is how you think about the development of programmable space. And what a lot of digitally driven architects do is say, look, I'm not interested in program, I'm interested in creating volumes and spaces, and I'll worry about program later. And what I'm saying in response is I have no problem with that at all. And I would want to see that as a very important form of research linked to how you think about volume creation, circulation, etc., etc. However, what I also think is that you can actually use the same mechanisms of research to think about program. And what you end up with on the screen when you do that, as many of you know as well as I, is something that looks architectural. Namely that your analysis has the appearance of architecture. So part of what I'm suggesting is that actually you can use the technologies to think about program and program relationships. You can do this if you think about making a model of an urban setting in order to test environments on it, etc., etc., all of which begins to take on the appearance of architecture, but it's not. It's simply the investigation of programmatic possibilities. Now, the danger is, as I said before, to rush to a realization of it, and it's a danger because it looks like a representation, and because it looks like a representation, you read it or interpret it representationally. And what I'm saying, and this is what I want to talk about with Malevich, which builds on the thing I did last semester here, was what was interesting about Malevich and others is that their notion of abstraction has to be thought outside the opposition abstraction and figure. So it's an abstraction not because it's not figurative, but for another reason. And at the AA, you and I can just remember 20 years ago when certain famous architects were here, they took the constructivists, took the abstract things and extruded them and said that was architecture, as though you turned the abstraction into architecture by taking a two-dimensional image and making it three-dimensional. And that is simply, I think, to misunderstand the relationship between abstraction and representation. But if that's right, and I can't prove it, but if that's right, what that forces back on us is the need to rethink the nature of abstraction. And that's where arguments about the diagram become interesting. And they're not abstract machines so that they can be anything. They're abstract in very precise ways. And it's how you... What the painter doesn't have to worry about is what to do with an abstraction. What the architect has to worry about is how something that is abstract attains form. And the creation of form is, after all, on one very banal level, a definition of architecture. The way in which form is created will be linked as much to the thinking about these terms as I suggested, as the very modes of production and their realization. Brian.
Sorry. I wondered if listening to you talk about the line, I was wondering if it might be generalizable to a sense of incipient crisis, not just in the line, but in the index, in Percy's sense. Because I sort of somehow sense that in digital processes, the original pristine nature of the indexical sign, as Peirce had described it, is eroded. It's lost. It immediately slips into an iconic and a symbolical register.
Yeah, but on one level, that sort of, Eisenman's use of Peirce is very much oriented around retaining a notion of the indexical but not the iconic. And my response, to what it's worth to him and also now to you in this instance, is to really worry about the viability of this terminology to talk about these sorts of images, or whether or not what's going on is recoupable in Peircean terms. I don't have a sort of fait accompli answer I'm suspicious, for what it's worth, about whether it works. And part of my implicit argument when I said that digital images don't remember, what I was meant was really quite specific. Well, clearly they form part of the tradition in which they're lodged. If it's a hospital, etc., etc. But the way in which most images remember allows for the archive in the way I was saying. Now, and therefore it's unclear to me whether or not the digital image remembers in the same way. And if that's the case, and that's the argument, if that's the case, then it's unclear to whether the notions of index and icon in Persa's sense are going to be apposite, or whether or not we need another language. And that's why I think the language of abstraction, the language of the relationship between the immaterial and the material, the relationship between potentiality and representation, and a whole series of other terminology that I would want to, for what it's worth, use, would be to try and indicate trying to subsume it into a pre-existing set of oppositions or terminology, to say, look, let's see what's demanded by it, and then at the very end, let's see whether that's compatible with somebody like Peirce or Saussure or whoever you want. But it just seems to me that I want to go, much more slowly than that. I want to see where the argument goes in developing it. I mean, if abstraction, as Malevich indicates, and I would want to argue, is linked to a notion of potentiality, then what becomes interesting with the idea of potentiality is its realization. And one of the interesting things about the distinction between painting and architecture, for example, could be located at that precise point. Namely, that potentiality would be understood fundamentally differently, because the formal presence of one is fundamentally different to the formal presence of the other. The material presence of one, etc., etc., etc. But nonetheless, I'd want to use these terms to begin to make sense of the arguments, because I do think that the key, I'll try and argue this, but I think the key term is abstraction, and not these terms. But I can't prove it. I'm suspicious of this sort of terminology.
I mean, it's just that I hitherto supposed the notion of an archive to be itself a version of the index.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, but if you accept that, then if you accept also the argument that the logic of the archive is undone by this, then it follows that the notion of index and icon is also undone. Yeah.
Basically, you were talking about like abstraction, like diagram, digital image, and building. And now,
and beauty.
And building. And
building.
Building.
Sorry,
Yeah.
beauty.
Building.
Beauty's good.
Now, like one of the points that you made was about if you make the digital image is an abstraction, and that sometimes the digital image is taken literally, and it goes straight to basically pretending that that's the image of the actual building. I think that there is another problem while you're working with the digital program is abstraction of what do you abstract, and what the abstraction give it to you in order to create the image of the building. So that now I think that there is basically the use of the digital is like to abstract, and from the abstract kind of you expect that it's going to come the product. But then I also think that there is a bigger problem is what exactly you abstract.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's very interesting, because let's start. The word abstract, as you know, has two meanings, and you're using the second. The first meaning is abstract, it's yet to be something. The second, abstract, means to remove something. To abstract something from something is to take a series of qualities and take them out. So the word abstract, as you know, is going to have these two different senses. Now, I was using abstract in the first sense, namely the abstract which is yet to be something. But the idea of abstract as removal, and if we could invent for a moment, let's think of abstract as addition as well as removal. So let's say abstract to. You can't say that in English, but let's say abstract from and abstract to. Now, one of the interesting things, if we could abstract to, like put something, intrude something in, and you can't say it, so don't ever say it, is if you, for example, take a certain plug-in to certain programs, you take, say, a swarm plug-in to Maya, you're creating something, but you cannot predict the automatic results of it. You can take an image from a digital image through Photoshop and into Illustrator. Into Photoshop, you can abstract 2 or 3 defining elements, open those up into Illustrator, abstract another 2 or 3 defining elements, move the same image from one program to another, then open the whole thing up into Maya as an animation. You cannot predict as a linear argument what's going to happen. Now, why you do that? Well, that's research. It's what researchers do. It's trying to find new ways of creating form and thinking. But this notion of abstracting from and reopening up in, the idea of the same image traveling through different programs, where you're abstracting little elements, you're abstracting into by introducing other elements. In each of these instances, the same image is being reconstructed, altered, fashioned, things are being taken out, etc., etc. The point would being that at every moment it's abstract because it still has potentials. And what becomes interesting in these sorts of things is how do we get to realize, because you're architects, how do we get to realize for architecture the potential of an image? And instead of sitting in front of it and thinking, gosh, that makes me think of blah blah, if you abstract, you can work on its abstract qualities. But that work on its abstract qualities is not based on, the poet confronting nature. It's by reopening elements of that image in another program and moving from one to another. So every sort of manipulation and operative device has to do with an array of techniques, not with the operation of the imagination. So what becomes interesting is that it's sort of, I'm being slightly polemical here, but just to give it a historical basis. In the 19th century, the great interesting debate in literature is between Zola and Baudelaire. Baudelaire hated photography because it said it ruined the imagination. Zola, much smarter guy, Zola hated photography because he said that what is real is the machinic nature of facts. We call it, his words, the mechanism of facts. That whether the social, like the human body, is a machine at work. What a photograph can't do is give you an image of a machine. Therefore, photography transgressed the real because it refused to show the ontology of becoming. It's the incessant movement that is the machine. So both of them hated photography. Now what Zola then said, look, what the novel has to become is where you can introduce elements into the machine to test adaptability, to see whether the machine is transformed by the addition of certain elements or certain elements are transformed by the machine. So Zola thought that the novel had to do with techniques. So he wrote this very famous pamphlet called The Experimental Novel, which is all about reducing the novel to a series of techniques rather than the work of the imagination. And I think it's not the same, but the analogy would work, is that if there is a mechanism, something that is driven by the notion of the operative, what becomes interesting is to experiment with its operational nature, rather than simply assume that what you do is contemplate something.
Okay, we're actually going to have to finish there
That's fine.
this evening, but there's plenty of time to continue these issues during the week. Andrew, thank you